the U.S. Ambassador to Pakistan, Cameron Munter. She holds a PhD in comparative literature from the Johns Hopkins University and a BA with a major in English from Cornell University. Among her many careers, she has worked as a diplomat, a consultant to nonprofit boards, and a writer for the 1984 Olympics in Los Angeles. She is the author of the Handbook on NGO Governance, which has been translated into 15 languages, and other publications and articles on various topics. Dr. Marilyn Wyatt currently works for the US Agency for International Development in Islamabad. So I'll hand over to you, Dr. Wyatt.
Thank you very much. Let me pull a little closer. Thank you everyone for coming here today. It gives me really a lot of pleasure to be here with three outstanding Pakistani women writers. We titled the session Women Writing Women. It remains to be seen whether that's a relevant title or not, but that will be one of our topics for conversation this morning. Let me please introduce here Muniza Naqvi, who is a writer and a columnist who actually is a full-time worker for the World Bank as well, which I just found out this morning, which is astonishing to me. She's the author of Mass Transit, On Air, Stay With Me, A Matter of Detail, and many essays and columns, also a playwright and the author of short stories. So welcome, Muniza. We have at the far end Bina Shah, who is a Karachi resident and the novel of many essays and short stories. I got to know Bina through her novel Slum Child, which I actually bought at this festival last year and thoroughly enjoyed, about a girl growing up in a poor community here in Karachi. She's also published a book called Where They Dream in Blue. So welcome Bina. And then finally we have Nafisa Haji, who's the author of two novels, Writing on My Forehead, which also takes place here and is about a young Pakistani woman who sort of who in the course of rebelling discovers her roots, and The Sweetness of Tears. Nafisa is active in Pakistani issues in the United States and also involved in many community initiatives. So welcome. As I said, we entitled this session Women Writing Women, and I want to start off with this theme because it's one that, frankly, I don't know a lot about, and I'm interested in hearing from you whether there's such a thing as sort of women's writing in Pakistan today. Is there a body of feminist literature? Is there a subgenre, of feminist writing? Or is it all just kind of chick lit? Or is there something different that you would describe as women's literature? What do you think about this, and how do you place your own books in that?
I'll take the question first. I think women's writing in Pakistan is extremely important, but underheard. As most women's voices are not heard, so is the case with women's writing. And it's an important genre, I think. I think it would be a mistake to fight against it and say that there shouldn't be one or that we shouldn't sort of divide ourselves. I think we need to stand up very strongly for women's writing and be proud of the fact that we are women writing. Because not so long ago that was something considered taboo. It was something that women in the subcontinent from good families and good backgrounds did not do. They would then start to write under pen names and so on and so forth. I think one of the most important initiatives in Pakistani women's writing was the collection of short stories edited by Muniza Shamsi called And the World Changed, which is an award-winning collection of the finest women's writing coming out of Pakistan today.
Okay, thank you. Rebuttal, response?
It's a complicated question to answer. And if I hold it up, can you hear me?
Is that better?
So for me, it's Can you hear me now?
Yeah.
Okay. So better.
Oh, yeah, that's better.
It's a complicated question to answer because when I was listening to your question, I thought, well, I just write. And I write, and I would have written if I was a man. And ovaries and the rest of the parts don't really make a difference because I think, the heart and the brain is the same. And so I kind of shy away from these labels, as we were discussing earlier, of genres, yes, in storytelling, but whether you're naturally, we have women's characters in novels, and the novels I write have women's characters, but they're not about women's issues. If I was to say anything about what I write about, my novels are political in nature. And those political issues affect women and men equally. So I have a very difficult time with that.
Isn't it, by definition, to be a woman's writer, to be political?
Now that is a different question. By definition, yes. To be a women's writer, to be a writer is to be political.
Okay.
I would say that. If you write, if you feel the need to write, you transcend yourself and your own situation, because your own situation and the world around you is intolerable. So you have to create a new place. And that is the fiction that you write. So, yes, and therefore it is political.
So to summarize, if I could pretend that that was a debate that took place, I think I would probably fall somewhere in the middle. I think I'm with Maneesa in the sense that I don't think about being a woman when I'm writing, per se. But obviously, the feminine experience has informed the kinds of stories that I write. It's not just that there are women in my books, but there is a feminine dynamic in them as well. And the question is interesting because this is something that I'm constantly having discussions about in my own head, if nowhere else, is how much similarity there is across the oceans and continents. And this very topic has been a controversial one of late with the New York Times and certain authors getting more press and review print in media, especially with the New York Times. They were attacked pretty strongly for that. And the idea of what is women's fiction. And I hear Bina, and I agree with the idea that the importance of it is there in terms of once it's written, that's a reality, and it's a reality that needs to be highlighted. And it's so exciting to see how vibrant a community of fiction, the community of women writers is in Pakistan. Once it's written, it's there. But my caveat is when we label and when we put it under one category, it excludes that other half sometimes from taking an interest in reading it. And I don't think the sphere of women and men should be so. This is something that's been true throughout the world, throughout history, the private sphere being the feminine and the public sphere being the masculine, and that is what is changing so rapidly as we look across the world. Different rates of change, but I really hate the idea of men not reading something because it's called women's fiction. And I think that when we, as women, write, we're not writing for the betterment of half of humanity. We're doing everybody a favor. So everyone should read us.
Thank you. Now, how about the world of writing here and publishing? And I'm interested in hearing from Amina on this one too. As a writer who is a woman, is it any easier, any harder to get published here, get your works published here, or is it still kind of an old boys club? What would you say about the obstacles that may or may not be facing women writers who are writing not only in English but in Urdu, in Sindhi, and other languages, and reaching out to a broader audience through publications?
Well, my novel Mass Transit was published in 1998 by Oxford University Press. So I'm a chief beneficiary of being published in Pakistan, and getting published is hard enough. So I was very fortunate for that to happen. There's a huge Urdu fiction market that you're largely unaware of us, those of us who write in English or read in English. But that's a huge part of the business, and I think Amina could probably speak to that. And women and men read those journals. That's pulp fiction, but it's there, and people love it. And they know their authors, and they're fantastic stories. And I think recently Muhammad Hanif translated a particular story which may be considered, by eyes or ears that haven't assumed things about Pakistan. They might think it's racy, but it's just for the mill here. Yeah.
I think the problem is it's not hard to write as a woman, but as happens a lot in our country and in most countries in the subcontinent and the Middle East, it's what women are writing about that's perceived as not as worthy as what men are writing about. I wrote an article for The Guardian a couple of years ago in which I famously called the Pakistani literature scene a boys' club, because you had 5 male writers and 1 female writer who were receiving the attention and the criticism and the reviews and the world's eye. And I said, why is that? Why is it men and 1 woman when I know there are at least 15 excellent women writers I could name for you? The perception is that men are writing about the heavy stuff. They're writing about politics. They're writing about war. They're writing about power. Women are writing the chicklet stuff. They're writing about the relationships and love and people, and this is perceived as somehow less worthy of the world's attention. So I think for me, it hasn't been that nobody wants to read me because I'm a woman, but I think people tend to classify women as lightweight and men as heavyweight, and that hasn't changed.
I would think, though, that it's an economic decision as well for the publishers. Is what's going to make money, what's going to sell.
Yeah, and that's something that is part of my experience in the West, is that women make up a huge part of the readership, probably out of proportion. So there's that. I think that's the mitigating factor, is the economics.
Well, the economics work in that women will buy books written both by men and women, and men will not. And you won't see a man picking up Jane Austen and saying, "Oh, I'd like to read this." He's going to be perceived as not quite masculine enough.
Right.
So we get back to perception.
Let me ask you a little bit about sort of the background of your writing. One thing that strikes me in reading your biographies that you all have in common is that you have had significant international experience as children and as adults both. To what extent has, or in what way, has that kind of experience been responsible for developing you as a writer, as a keen observer of human life and manners?
I think one of the most basic, and I think you'll probably both agree with me on that, is just that experience of being an outsider, looking into a window, and that is extremely helpful.
You could say how you were now.
Yeah, I was born and mostly raised in the United States. My parents did the whole, we're going home, we've made our pot of gold when I was 6, and we moved here for a year. And then I lived in other places as well, including England, and Manisa and I have the Philippines in common. I'm so excited to talk about that with her, because I don't know anybody else who's ever lived in the Philippines with the same background. But that the experience of always being on the outside, looking into something else, and the struggle initially is always about fitting in when you're very young, but that becomes a big asset, because you can be in any situation and place yourself on the outside and have that become a wealth of material in terms of writing.
Just to add to that, I'd have to agree. I was born in Pakistan, and I lived in Pakistan for my formative years. I lived here till the age of 20 in Mangla and Tarbela and Lahore, and I worked in Karachi during the 80s. But the experience of being an outsider is an extremely important, I think, factor for any writer. And you can have lived in your alley or your gully or your mohalla all your life, or even in one house without leaving it. And you can still be an outsider and a writer, and you can be a fine writer. The important thing is I think something happens to most writers that take them out of themselves and make them perceive the other. And in perceiving and feeling the other, they become an outsider. And we all know what those things are. They are usually some, transformative event that lifts you out of yourself and creates that eye for you, that third eye, which makes you that foreigner forever, and which makes you a tourist forever, and creates all those voices in your head. And you can be an internationalist having never left the four walls of your house.
I need to say hi to Mrs. Coso, who I can see in the audience there. She's our Spanish teacher at our American school. I went to the Karachi American School. And that school really saved me because I think for me the writing was not about outside, inside. I was just confused. I went to the United States at a very young age. I came back at a young age. I went to the American school where I didn't know what I was. Was I Pakistani? Was I American? I've spent half my childhood here and half my childhood there. And so I just didn't know what I was. Who was I? Why did I feel one way? Why did I talk a certain way? Why did I look like some people but sound like other people? And why was my family a certain way, so different to our relatives, other people? So for me, writing was a way of starting to clear the confusion. It was therapy, and it was a way of understanding, because believe me, in 1977, Pakistan was as confusing as it is today. Mm-hmm. As crazy a political scene, as crazy a social scene, the same inequities, it's just more amplified today. So for me, writing was a way of trying to understand where I had landed up, where I had been, who I was, and who I'm going to become.
Bina, you just returned from the Iowa Writers' Workshop, which is a very well-known workshop in the middle of cornfields in Iowa, that offers a retreat-like setting for writers to talk to each other, to test their works on each other. A couple of years ago, H.M. Naqvi went and said it was a very worthwhile experience. How was it for you to get away from Pakistan in order to write about Pakistan?
I had always maintained that I couldn't be a writer anywhere else but Karachi, but it proved me wrong. Because to go to the U.S. and spend 10 weeks in the middle of cornfields, but yet being in Iowa City, which is an incredibly cultured place, right in the middle of the Midwest. It's a UNESCO City of Literature, the only one in North America, thanks to the efforts of the director of the IWP. And to be there and to have time away from my immediate surroundings, to look at it with some distance, was amazing. And then to be with 36 other writers from 32 different countries. They call it the United Nations of Writers. So to spend intensive amounts of time where before I had always felt fairly isolated as a writer, and so to commune with people who were doing the same thing as me, who are as creative and as eccentric as I am, you get a real feeling of community and kinship.
No longer the outsider, huh?
We were all crazy.
Oh. I'd like to ask each of you to read at intervals from short excerpts from your work, and I wonder, Nafisa, would you like to go first? Sure. Tell us what you're going to read. And
Thank you. Do you want me to hold? Let me see if I can. I think I can juggle both. And given that we were talking about women writing women, I thought my second book is one of the ideas that was the genesis for it was the idea of those segregated worlds of feminine and masculine, but from the point of view, just a story from my own background. I was having a conversation with my brother once, and I was reminiscing about time spent with my aunts, my mom, my grandmothers, and all the sort of storytelling, the family history that you get from those times spent. And he reminded me that he wasn't there because he was kicked out of the room. And those feminine circles that are private sometimes, and the boys do get kicked out of them, or at least did, hopefully less and less, got me thinking about how, relating to what I said earlier, how the sort of absence of, or the imbalance of feminine and masculine energy, feminine and masculine power, is not just something that does damage to women, but to men as well, in terms of how we exclude them. So I'm going to read a little bit. It's about it. This is the voice of a young man who's remembering his childhood. Something dramatic has happened. There's nothing dramatic in what I'm going to read, but something dramatic has happened, and he's having to revisit his childhood, and he's looking at it, having sort of realized how feminine the orbit of his childhood world was, and he's recalling how his mother used to tell him stories and sing him songs, and how important she was to his childhood. So it's a very quiet moment in the book. It's not a dramatic plot point. After the story was done, my mother and I would be silent, listening together to the sounds of the neighbors' houses on either side of us, a mother calling out to the young girls who lived on one side of us, the lady of the house shouting for the servant on the other. Before sunset, the last of the street hawkers would roll down the street, calling out the merits of their wares in a song they sang from morning till sundown, pushing carts filled with everything from toys and sweets to fruits and vegetables. We never purchased any of the latter. Instead, several mornings each week, my mother would take me with her in a rickshaw to Sabzi Mandi, the vegetable market, drawing her chiffon dupatta over her head as we left the house. We walked to the nearest intersection to hail the putt-putting motorized tricycles that are everywhere in Karachi. There, venturing out of the small world of our home, I sensed how happy she was to be out and about in the hustle and bustle of a major metropolis. At the market, she would touch and smell the fruits and vegetables as I clung to the hem of her kameez, answering the salams of the vendors who recognized her and who laughed heartily when she shook her head at the prices they quoted, saying to me in a voice they could hear that she would have to make ek piyaza instead of do if the cost of onions continued to rise, using half the number of onions for the recipe that called for an abundance of them. They called her sister or daughter, and she called them brother or uncle, and I saw how my mother enjoyed these interactions, anonymous acquaintanceships that must have felt safe to someone who spent most of her life in a state of social seclusion that I was oblivious to. I don't think my mother had any friends apart from these gentlemen and Masi. I was an extremely shy child and rarely spoke to anyone outside the walls of our home. When a favored vendor, the one whose prices my mother trusted the most, tried to talk to me on occasion, "Eh Baba, what vegetable will you help your mother prepare today?" I remember pulling on my mother's dupatta, sharing the veil so that it shaded my head as well as hers, stretching the long scarf over my face, looking out through a grainy lens of chiffon, gray, dark blues and greens, brown or white, depending on the colors of the shalwar kameez suit that my mother had donned that day, cotton lawns in summer and linens in winter, tailored from sober-colored and subtly printed fabrics, widow's colors of mourning, dull. I would cautiously assess the man's friendly eyes against the fearsome growth of hair above his lips, a thick, dark mustache curled villainously at its ends. The vendor would laugh at me, revealing brown betel nut-stained teeth, and smile at my mother, who would turn away, also smiling, and earnestly resume the task of lifting and turning tomatoes, checking their ripeness, always careful to regulate these familiarities, according to unspoken rules of engagement between men and women, between lower and upper classes. When we came home, after cooking and showering the smell of spices and onions out of her hair and skin, my mother prayed, putting aside her chiffon scarf to don the thicker white chadar of prayer that veiled her hair and the shape of her body. When she bowed for sajda, I would sometimes climb up onto her back, my arms encircling her neck tightly, a passenger on the journey of her prayers. She would stay prone, her forehead pressed to the prayer rug, waiting for something else to distract me off my perch before rising back to the sitting position of her namaz. Her patience was boundless. I was everything to her, I knew.
Beautiful. Is this an autobiographical description?
I probably wrote on my mother's back. I don't remember, but I've seen many children who do that prayer image, and I've seen it in my own son. The boys wear the chadars as well, and that image. So no, not specifically, but I think it's one that many of us can relate to.
Nafisa, tell us, when did you first decide to be a writer or become aware of the fact that being a writer was your fate and your destiny?
When I was 8, and I read Little Women, and I read about Jo in the garret with her apples and the pet rat. So that was a book that my mom had gotten me and urged me to read, and I did and loved it. It's also partly the inspiration of a couple of the characters in this novel. One of the main characters is named Joe. And so I always knew I wanted to be a writer. I think everybody has that story. They're our heroes. They take us on journeys all around the world. They make us the humans that we aspire to be. And so who doesn't want to be like that? Yeah.
And how about you, Muniza? Was it also a decision or just something that was to be? I mean, how do you combine it with your full-time other identity, other job?
Every time I'm asked that question, I try to come up with a new answer, but I just write. I always wrote, and I write all the time.
You mentioned you travel a lot. Are you able to write in strange hotel rooms and on board airplanes?
Can travel, can write standing up, sitting down, lying down, in a jeep, on one leg. Pretty much write. So I write, and I don't know what else to do. And maybe I have the luxury to write because my life is organized around writing. So even the work involves a lot of writing and writing. So.
And what are you working on now?
There's a novel brewing in my head, and I've got it in my head, and pretty soon it's going to find its way onto paper, but it's going to take a little bit of time. So I've been churning out novels, but this one's going to take a little bit more time, and that's a good segue into what I'm going to read for you. You're going to have to bear with me because this is as new to you as it is to me. There was a book that I put together this year, and I only saw it an hour ago because it's just fresh off the press, and it's called Festival, and it's a book that's accompanying the Karachi Literature Festival this year. And it has 48 writers in it, but if you count myself and my mother, that makes 50. My mother passed away a year ago, and that was, as you know, what that possibly means. And many years ago, not that many years ago, about 5 years ago, I had just come back from a book reading. In fact, a book reading for And the World Changed, book that Muniza Shamsi edited. And we were sitting around the dining table in New York, and I think it was my sister-in-law who asked my mother, "Ammi, did you ever want to write a novel? You're surrounded by children who write, and your husband writes. Did you ever want to write a novel?" And my mother said yes. My mother was a very quiet woman, and she wasn't given to self-promotion at all. And she said yes, and we all stopped. And I think it was I who asked her, what would have been the first line, opening line of your novel? And without stopping, without thinking, she said, गाड़ी तेजी से उन गलियों को छोड़ती चली जा रही थी जहां हम सदियों से रहते चले आ रहे थे. I used the word तेजी, but she had said मिनटों में. गाड़ी मिनटों में उन गलियों को छोड़ती चली जा रही थी जहां हम सदियों से रहते चले आ रहे थे. The train was leaving in minutes the alleyways that we had come living in for centuries. And I was standing there, I think I was in the kitchen washing dishes. I just burst out crying because that one sentence was full of so much. And either you could look at it as a tragedy or as an opportunity for something great that was about to begin. And I knew that I was carrying that pain of departures that had a whole generation had felt at the time of partition. Anyways, that would have been the opening line of her novel. And I quickly asked her to write it down in Urdu for me in a notebook. And after she passed away, I took that piece of paper and I framed it. And I kept it on my desk. And last June, I wrote to as many writers that I could think of for whom I had emailed. And I said I had come to their threshold, much like a villager does in Ethiopia. They go to their neighbor's house to borrow an ember to be able to light their own fire. And so I was coming to their threshold, asking them for an ember, maybe a line, a paragraph, a poem, a short story, that they would be willing to give to me so that I could weave it into a story that I was going to write, because I had suddenly lost sight of stories. And from June till September of last year, I was overwhelmed. In the beginning there was silence, and then by one, things started to trickle in. A writer here one day, two writers the next day, started to send me things. Here, take it. Here, this is for you. Here's a sentence. Here's a paragraph. Here, I've written this short story for you. Use it. And so this makes up for that experience. And I'm going to read to you. After they wrote, sent me in all their pieces, I wrote the last piece, as I had said I would. And I'll just read you a small portion of that. It's called Afterward, a Fire, a Feast, a Festival. And now, showing my age, I need my glasses because I can't see. May I have an ember from your fire? I had asked writers if they would lend me or send me an idea with which to ignite a piece of writing. I wrote to writers for whom I had addresses. Most to whom I wrote I did not personally know, but knew them through their work. A few responses were immediate, needing no instructions or explanations. Some needed more time to give, more time to tend their own fires, more time to understand what exactly I wanted. Responses felt much like when in a city, on a busy sidewalk, on a bus, or on the subway, when paths cross with a stranger, an exchange of glances can lead to a recognition, something enough to elicit a nod or a smile, transmit a message, yes, there you are, and here I am. You are not alone. I see you. The acknowledgement itself is a gift. By mid-September, I had received word from at least 53 writers, of which 48 gave. The act of asking and its reaction seemed to have shaped into being anarchist and cooperative. It was individual and collective, random and organized. I felt that I had been alone in my quest. And yet the call was in a way communal in the request, selfishly eliciting generosity. Give me your words, any words, so I can use them as I choose. It was a proposal for an exchange, only of asking and giving without any further structure. It was not a monetary transaction, and then came the responses of giving. The experiment was overwhelming. From 21st June to 29th September, the responses arrived and it felt like being at a book festival, wandering through conversations and being left with impressions of each. Each response received, indeed, was that metaphorical ember. It was and is an offering, a gift, an offering received and hopefully an offering that keeps transforming, changing as it is received. These responses received one or two every other day or week by email felt like the letters that no longer arrived in the mail, that used to be brought by a postman. I have craved and longed for these letters. Is there a place somewhere where letters are piling up for me? I miss receiving them and I miss writing them. I miss the envelopes and addresses, the stamps, the handwriting. I miss the waiting. I miss the anticipation of letters. Letters in which the sentences were thoughtful and were meant as messages for me, the dedicated thoughts conveying news, conveying emotion, updates elicited through a query of, how are you? I hope this finds you well. I trust you are well. All meant as openings to write of how one is. An offering in the form of caring. How are you? An offering of how one is and of how we are, how we can be. A generosity of giving of oneself. I had called out on the proverbial night of the page, sent up a flare, is anyone there? And after a silence, banners and lights began to appear. Over the dunes, yes, like banners joining in, here and there, proclaiming, you are not alone.
What a wonderful experience and a loving tribute to your mother. Thank you for sharing that. Bina, tell us a little bit about your formation as a writer. We want to hear from you too, but I wonder if you could, look back and tell us also, how did you become a writer? Did you?
Well, my parents wanted me to be a doctor.
All right. Good.
And I tried, but I kept failing the science classes and doing really well in the English classes. So that was my first clue.
Uh-huh. Are they supportive of you being a writer now?
They're right there.
All right.
My
Yay,
parents
Mom
are
and
right
Dad.
there. And two things. I could not have been a writer without being a Pakistani, living in Pakistan, and I couldn't have been a writer without the support of those two people right there. So I want to publicly acknowledge them and thank them for everything they've done for me. I didn't come to writing straightforwardly. These days, the trend is to get an MFA, and attendant with that, all the contacts and all the sort of, not that it's not hard any way you do it, but when you go the MFA route, which is immensely popular in the US and the UK at the moment, the path is clearer. And for me, the path was always circuitous and very unclear. I just knew that writing was something I loved, as reading has always been something I loved. I started to get encouragement from teachers. I started to win prizes. And it was a pleasure to do. When I wrote, it never felt like work. Now it feels like work because I do it professionally. But as a passion and as a love and a joy, it was the easiest thing to do. And it's the thing I do the best. I'm a writer because I can't do anything else very well.
But do you still have that corner of your writing where it feels like a joy and a passion and a pleasure, not work?
That's not a corner. That's everything. The work is technical. It's your craft. It's what you do as you would do if you were a plumber or as you would do if you were a doctor. You have craft, but what we have in writing in any kind of art is that absolute transcendence from yourself into another world. And that is just what, we're travelers, so I think traveling to these imaginary worlds in our minds is what keeps us hooked as writers.
What are you going to read for us today?
I'm going to read you a very short extract from a short story that has now turned into a novel called Peter Pachman Goes to Pakistan. And this is the novel that I was working on while I was in Iowa City. I've just completed the first draft.
All right.
So you're going to get the teaser. Peter Pachman Goes to Pakistan. Can everybody hear me well enough? No? My mom can't hear me because I talk too much at home. So, everyone had warned Peter Pachman not to go to Pakistan. You're taking your life into your hands out there. Don't be crazy, Peter. Yet here he was now, stretched out in his Emirates business class seat, earphones piping in a pleasant mix of golden classics as he flew from Dubai to Karachi, hoping nobody would kill him while he was on his 3-day trip. Flesher, his boss, had described it as a training session for the local staff, but the way he'd gripped Pachman's hand in his own, squeezing down with his meaty fists
and the manly clap on the shoulder, he might as well have said suicide mission, not training mission. Darlene had even tears in her eyes as she'd handed him his tickets, and Pachman had almost quit then and there. But Pachman knew that his life would end far quicker if he refused the assignment. The resulting demotion, eventual dismissal, and certain unemployment would dry up his meager savings account in the Wells Fargo Bank within a month, and then he'd be homeless as well as jobless in Chicago. Better to face a trip to Karachi, where they'd killed Daniel Pearl and bombed the U.S. consulate, than face a month without a paycheck in America these days. Pachman twisted the wedding ring on his finger and watched the screen in front of him as the little white plane inched closer and closer to Karachi on the electronic map. They'd be landing in the next 15 minutes, he guessed. Suddenly, a disembodied voice on the PA system announced, without any warning, "Due to safety regulations, Karachi Airport, we must spray the cabin. If you wear contacts, you might want to cover your..." And the flight attendants were running down both aisles, holding aloft spray cans jetting out a sickly-smelling liquid, which made Pachman's eyes burn as if he'd been maced. He began to scream out loud in pain and outrage, but quickly clamped his lips down over his teeth and tried to flush out his eyes with the contents of his bottle of mineral water, helpfully supplied by the cabin purser. Just when he thought things were calming down, he picked up the complimentary pre-landing hot towel and pressed it to his face. The lemon perfume in the towel rekindled the fire in his eyes. Pachman sat quivering in his fully upright seat with an eye mask over his face until the plane screeched to a halt at the end of the runway. He remained motionless, surrounded by the sounds of seatbelts clicking, overhead bins springing open, dozens of exhausted passengers getting out of their seats and trooping towards the warm blast of air that came from the open doors. "There, there," said the purser, patting him soothingly on the shoulder. "No need to be afraid. See, we're on the ground, safe and sound." "Thank you," muttered Pachman, removing the eye mask and blinking at the now empty cabin. "It's my pleasure. Really, sir, fear of flying's nothing to be ashamed of. I don't even like flying myself." Pachman's eyes were still stinging even an hour after he disembarked in Karachi, cleared immigrations and customs, and collected his luggage, a bright fuchsia vanity case from the baggage carousel. Muhammad was waiting for him outside the airport, holding up a sign that read, "Mr. Peter Pachman." But Pachman almost missed him, stumbling through the doors with his thumbs pressed into the corners of his watering eyes. "Are you okay, sir?" said Muhammad. "Yes, well, they sprayed something in the cabin before landing. I don't know what it was, and I wear contacts, so it's stinging just a little bit," said Pachman. Muhammad was peering at Pachman with a look of concern. "Will you be all right? Do you need any medicine?" He was a thin, slight man, his thighs in their tight black pants hardly any bigger than Pachman's upper arms. He could have been anywhere from 19 to 40 years old, but Pachman guessed he was about 28. He spoke his English carefully, as if tasting a food he hadn't ever had before. No, I'm fine. Pachman felt anything but fine. He was dizzy seeing the crowds of people, feeling the afternoon heat pressing onto every inch of skin that wasn't covered by clothing, breathing in unfamiliarly heavy, humid air. He took his thumbs out of his eyes and bent down to pick up his cases, but Muhammad immediately reached forward for Pachman's laptop bag. Pachman flinched and turned away, proffering instead the pink vanity case to him. When Muhammad bent a second time to retrieve the case from Pachman's tight grip, Pachman had to make an effort to peel each frozen finger away from the handle. The car was better than Pachman had expected. A Toyota Land Cruiser with powerful air conditioning and a GPS screen on the dashboard, which reassured Pachman that he wasn't in completely uncharted territory. But as soon as Muhammad arranged himself behind the steering wheel and switched on the engine, the GPS screen sprang to life and a woman's voice came out of it, gabbling in Japanese. A map on the screen appeared to show the streets not of Karachi, but of Tokyo. And the woman began to scream hysterically as Muhammad put the car into reverse and began to back out of the parking space. According to the map, they were about to drive off the Rainbow Bridge and fall into the Tokyo Bay. "Oh yes," said Muhammad calmly, "we haven't changed the CD as yet. This car is very new. He patted the dashboard in a gesture of appreciation. So there is a CD for Karachi, Pachman asked. If his luck held out, he'd get through the next 3 days, then go back home and quit his job. Anything to never have to come back here again. There are many CDs for Karachi. Ahmed eased the car around the curving exit road and waited for the green light at the intersection, in front of a row of dilapidated buildings. A looming billboard that advertised Magnum ice creams with a woman holding a huge chocolate bar, lasciviously poised half in and half out of her heavily lipsticked mouth. But I do not trust any of them. Best to just ask someone who knows the city. Not all the streets have names. Some have many names. Pachman was intrigued. What do you mean? Well, this road we are on, it is known as Drig Road, but it is also called Share Faisal. Why? It changed after the British left. Many roads changed, from British names to Muslim names. Elphinstone Street became Zebunissa Street. Like that only. Bachman stared at arcing flyovers curling around picturesque gardens, concrete blocks with lines of washing hanging over miniature balconies, office blocks whose glass windows glinted in the afternoon sun. Beauty wrestled with ugliness all along the main artery, which Muhammad negotiated with the confidence of a Formula One driver. There was no concept of a fast lane and a slow lane. Motorcycles and rickshaws occupied the right side of the road with impunity. Buses and trucks wove left and right in intricate patterns of roadmanship, all defying any traffic rules that might have been in existence. White uniformed policemen slouched impotently at the intersections, while menacing commandos manned the overhead bridges, submachine guns slung carelessly over their shoulders. I'm in the most dangerous country in the world, Pachman thought to himself.
Oh,
Thank
that's
you.
Very good. Thank you very much. I want to leave time for some questions and answers, but I feel that in a session with the title of this one, I have to ask you all, at the risk of opening a very big topic, are you optimistic for women in Pakistan today? How do you?
We're here, aren't we?
In what way? And you know, what do you see happening in women's lives here that makes you feel optimistic?
We can't be shut up. We're not going back. We're here and get used to it.
Well, there are lots of reasons to be optimistic in Pakistan for women. If you look at the statistics, you see how well girls do in school and how they are excelling. And if you look at our colleges and universities, there's a higher rate of women in those colleges and schools. In one way, that's because of their doing well. On the other hand, there is a harsh reality, which is that boys have to work, they have to go earn a living, and so they are being excluded. So at the moment, it's not being a matter of being optimistic only for women, but also having to worry about our boys. I think that the women of South Asia, and particularly the area which is Pakistan of South Asia, women are very strong. If there are weak and soft women, they're probably in the upper echelons. The rest of them are tough as, army boots.
All right.
Yeah,
Okay.
right. They kick ass.
This is a really interesting topic because one of the things that I wrestle with in the West is that stereotype of the oppressed Muslim woman, and stereotype that unfortunately, you can't get away from the underbelly of it that is reflected in the only thing that people see in the West in terms of the media. And someone asked me, I had an event the day before I left, and someone in the Q&A said, well, as a feminist, because I mentioned being a feminist in the talk, what will you have to say to the women of Pakistan when you go? And I don't want to sound like I'm mocking that person because I've been there. I born and raised in the States, coming here having the same self-righteous mentality as that person who was asking as a young person, always thinking that I had something to say or I had something to offer. But I've grown up, so my answer to her was, well, what I'm most interested in doing is going and listening, because I know It's a country filled with amazingly strong women doing hard work that I've never done for the betterment of women and men. And so I want to go and learn from them because I believe in that. I believe in the strength of what I've seen. And less than 24 hours into the literary festival, nothing but my expectation has been borne out pretty excellently.
I would say by the three of you, pretty amazing and accomplished women. I'd love to open the floor to any questions that you want to pose to our authors. Now's your chance. Yes? Do you want to stand? And yeah.
She's amazing too.
Ah, good.
Question
Another
actually
accomplished woman, huh?
is for a piece I'm doing for Miss Magazine, which is a feminist magazine in America. And I was intrigued, Nafisa, by what you said in that, and actually which was echoed by many of you, that when you write, you don't write as a woman. And I was hoping for a clarification on that because as a Pakistani woman, I was born and raised here, you are never allowed to forget that you are a woman in Pakistan. So are you saying that as a form of protest against that? Or are you saying that, or is that a symbol of this sort of anachronism that I see where a lot of the post-feminist arguments about choice and it's my choice and this and that are brought to this context, which I would argue is not even really feminist yet. So I just want to hear your thoughts on that. Everyone on the panel. Thank you, Dr. White.
Thank you. Good question.
Yeah. I know you're rearing it a bit.
Yes, the answers have been defensive, I admit. And you see, the problem with, it goes back to being labeled. I have a real problem with that. And we are in a world of labels. But being feminist, I was born feminist. You know, I was raised by a feminist father and a feminist mother. And I've been all over the world because of the work I do. And I'm deeply involved in the world that I live in different countries. And I find Pakistanis in general to be feminist, deeply feminine in the way they think, whether they're men or women. Yes, we have tremendous amounts of issues, but those are issues more of class and power and income that are confused and used by being termed as, you know, the oppression of women. There are bigger issues. You solve those issues, and this issue will be solved.
I want to say that I write as a woman, and I'm always conscious of being a woman. And not only do I write as a woman, I write for women. I think one of my strongest jobs, one of my most important jobs is to be a voice for women. And living in Pakistan and seeing what women go through here, I am not ashamed to do that. I'm proud of it.
It's funny, your question reminded me of some of the discussion that happened after our last presidential election about living in a post-racial society in America. And it's the same angst, I think, that's behind the question. And of course, we're not in a post-feminist context to me. So when I give talks, I talk about being feminist. And that's something that I never understood women of my generation sort of rejecting that label. I didn't get that. But having said that, writing is extremely, and I'm not one of those writers who says that I write with no audience in mind. I absolutely write hoping to be read. I think that writing is a form of communication. I never understood that. When writers say that, I just don't get it. It's not in my experience. I want my work to be read. But it is a personal thing. So that is the humanist in me. So if you can be a feminist and a humanist, and you know, if it's a hierarchy, I'm a humanist when I'm writing. So that's what I meant by not being conscious of it. The same thing as being boxed in as a Muslim American writer or a Pakistani American writer. I happen to share Maniza's allergy to labels from that same point of view.
Thank you. Good question. Thank you. Another question. Yes, please. I wonder if, can we use the, yeah, thank you.
Want to try these again?
Yeah, I suppose we could use these. And,
Yeah, let's try. That's a good idea. Yeah, they're on. You have to press the button. But you turn them off when you turn them on.
Hello.
Good idea.
My name is Nigar. I'm a cartoonist. I wanted to ask you, when you are writing, does the political atmosphere and the sparky relationships between US and Pakistan ever affect your work?
yeah, how? Why don't we just use these? Are these working? Should be. Mine is.
This one is.
Oh, God. I think it's fairly evident from what I just read out that well, the novel itself is all about an American in Pakistan. It's on? This is on too? Oh, all right.
Now
That's
it is,
on.
yeah.
Tika, shukriya. Yeah, I mean, from what I just read out, I think, yes.
Yeah, that was, it touched, sort of kind of touched the brim a bit. What about the other writers?
Everything I've written is shaped by General Ziaul Haq. Everything. In fact, I think there is someone in the audience, a dear friend of mine, who said to me, "Ab tumne 3 kitabein likhti? You've written 3 books at that time. Not even one dedicated to your greatest inspiration." Next one, make it for General Ziaul Haq. You know what I mean? So I am completely, unapologetically, consumed by the experience of military dictatorships and the United States' role in supporting those. And more recently with the war in Afghanistan and the wars all over the world. This is something that I know I should get away from, write more joyous things, more conciliatory things, but I cannot. This is what shapes me. These are my novels. They're not pretty. And I would highly recommend you do not go out and buy Stay With Me. You'll be depressed. It happens. It's claustrophobic because the main character in it, the protagonist, is being interrogated and tortured and has no idea what she has done. In fact, she has no idea who she is. And if you look at the last 10 years, for Pakistan, it has been an interrogation. It has been a torture. We're not even sure what our crime is exactly. Okay, so that's Stay With Me.
Yeah. Yeah, definitely. That was so. I have to think about what you said for a long time because that was beautifully put. But from the flip side of things, yes, definitely from that. Again, sorry about the labeling, but the hyphenated American experience, and that having to explain all the time or be on call for the explanation and the justification of who you are. When I grew up in the States, when people would ask me, "Where are you from?" and I'd say, "LA," and they'd say, "No, really, where are you from?" And then, because they were asking really, yeah, exactly. But it was a different world, so I'd say Pakistan, and there would be this look of, huh? And I'd have to say, well, it's next to India. And those were the good old days. And now when the same thing happens and you say Pakistan, you don't have to say next to India. Instead, the look that comes on is a little bit of a shrinking away and kind of fear, like checking out if I have anything bulky under my clothes. So yes, definitely. And that's one of the caveats for myself about writing is that you have a tendency when you're writing in the West to be the tourist guide, the tour guide, and that's really annoying, to have to read. But it's inescapable. It is part of the way that I write. It's trying to bridge that gap, and it's going back to what I was talking about before, the humanist thing. This is human. These people are human beings, and that I'm writing about, and they don't represent any country or any culture. They just happen to be individuals who happen to come from a certain part of the world. So.
Thank you. I have just been informed that it's sadly time to wrap up, but I would just like to end on a happy note and say that it's thanks to the writings of women like you that I think are enriching the perspective, the understanding of readers around the world of what it means to be Pakistani, what it means to be living in Pakistan, and what your hopes and dreams and experiences are. So thank you very much for your excellent output. We look forward to seeing more often from all of you, and thank you very much for joining us on the panel today.
Thank you for having us.
And thanks to all of you for joining us, too.